Hi, my name is Janine Helton, and I am so thrilled to be with you today. Thank you for joining me. And I will be painting a small portrait, very close up. I like to do these little ones as practices and studies. It's a great way to just become proficient in painting the features of a face, and also it's a great way to just experiment with color and other kinds of things that you might not be quite as free to do on a larger piece. I am working on a 5x5. You are welcome to work larger if you like. I do have my my reference photos pinned to the board along with my drawing. The color version, the black and white, and the posterized version, they just kind of help guide me as I'm creating layers, and they really help with values and all kinds of things. So it's good to have those nearby, and it's good to refer to them often. I'm excited. Let's get started. Okay, so I noticed a couple little things that I'd like to just mask out before we start. That light line across her eye, I believe, are her the tips of her eyelashes. So I just want to touch those. I mean, this is very minuscule. And then a couple highlights in the other eye. Just a few dots will keep those sparkly areas clean. Just be careful not to overdo it. It's really easy to get carried away. Okay, I think we're ready to begin our first layer. I'm just going to mix up about 10% value of 3 colors. I normally use a triad, red, yellow, and blue, but today I'm wanting to keep her real sunny and warm, so I am starting with a quinacridone gold with plenty of water and just a little bit of pigment. I want approximately a 10% value. If you look at the reference photo, you can see how light her flesh is in the sun, and that's the layer, the value I'm going for here. So again, mixing well and checking the value. And let's move on to quinacridone coral, which I love. So I'm mixing these 3 colors separately on my palette, and I'm going to apply them separately and allow them to mix on the page. I don't have a formula for flesh. I just use combinations of my yellows and reds and oranges. And I like to start out pretty vibrant, and then I can always tone it down with a blue or a green. Okay, once your colors are mixed, I'm just going to start working left to right, top to bottom. I'm going to cross right over the hair, go outside of the face in places. I don't like things to look cut out, and the hair is going to be darker anyway. So I'm just alternating. I try not to rinse my brush between the colors because I don't want to dilute them. They're already pretty thin and they're just how I want them. So I don't want to water it down anymore. So as I go down the page, here I'm going around the eyes. I actually normally don't do that, but I think I'm wanting to keep the whites of her eyes cooler than her flesh, so that's why I decided to go around them this time. If you forget, it's not a big deal. Really just wanting to get color down, working from the beads. I don't go back into the face. Once I've got the color there, I just continue working downward. I see a little bead on her chin, so I'm going to want to pull that out so she doesn't get a bloom on her face. And actually I'm working with two brushes. I've got both of my smaller Kolinsky sables. One of them is being reserved for clean water and damp, so I can tickle edges like that. Here I'm really getting the moisture out of that brush so I can lift some highlights on the flesh. I, again, don't normally do this either, but believe it or not, I went a little darker on this piece than I normally do. So I'm just wanting to lift up some of those highlights. She's has such a sunny face and it's so light. I want to make sure that I capture those highlights. If you go in here with too much water on your brush, you're going to get blooms. So be sure you've got most of the water off the brush. Okay, the paper is probably still slightly damp, but as long as I'm using thicker paint, less water, more pigment, I can start working on these darker areas and the features. So I've got Quin Magenta and Brilliant Orange, and I'm kind of just going back and forth with those. Again, I don't have formulas. I just go through my warm colors usually in the beginning. According to value, magenta's darker, so I'm using that on the inside of the ear, and I'm using the orange more to soften things out and do the lighter areas. I could just have as easily have picked yellow or Scarlet Lake. So every area of this portrait will get several layers of paint. So don't worry if you feel like this is too dark or if it's not perfect. Just keep working. Try not to get too caught up in perfection. I know that's hard sometimes. And I'm looking at the reference photos, and especially the posterized version and the black and white version, where I can see the darkest dark shadows. So I'm doing those with this magenta and orange. Just starting to establish things here and there. I always work around the page, so if I put a color on her ear, I'm going to put it in other areas of the painting. I'm going to strengthen that mixture, the Quin Magenta with the orange, and so that I can start doing the eyelid. I often just make a little chisel with my Kolinsky sable, and I can paint these fine lines, but sometimes I just want to switch right back and use my pointy synthetic brush, which I'm doing here, just to get these really fine lines and make sure I get these details right. The eyes are so important to get the shapes right. So use whatever brush you're comfortable with. You know, that'll work for the job you need done. So getting the little inside corners of the eye with some Scarlet Lake. So this is such a small piece that I'm just using my 9 and 12 Kolinsky sable brushes, as well as my number 8 pointy synthetic. And getting the other eye, the eyelid crease. I like to drop in blues while that paint is still wet to darken the value. And then I can take that little brush and pull out the eyelashes just very carefully. I'm not worrying about every eyelash, but thinking shapes, and I'm not worried about color at this point. It's going to be layered. They're going to go darker, and I've got blue on my brush, so that's what I'm using. Moving on to the nostrils, I want a nice warm dark. So I'm adding some more Quin Magenta with the Scarlet Lake mixture and thinking about adding some blue to it, but I think I'm just going to go with the Perylene Maroon, and that'll make it nice and dark. So remember, the top of the nostrils are hard edged and the bottoms are soft. So with my second damp clean brush, I'm just tickling the bottom. So I tend to go back and forth with my Kolinsky Sables. One of them has the pigment and the other one is just a damp clean brush so I can soften edges. And back to the pointy brush for some more eye details. Couldn't resist while I had the color mixed up. So I'm going into some shadow areas. So just looking carefully at my reference photos to where these shadows are. Some of these little shadows from the flyaway hairs. And tickling some edges so they're not too perfect. And I want to keep an eye on what's going on around the page. It looks like I need to soften those nostrils a little bit with my clean damp brush. And then I'll start to get some form around the nostril. I lay down the paint with one brush, and then with the second brush I just tickle the edges. So I've got hard edges on one side and soft on the other. And I try to do that throughout the painting and have a nice variety of edges. I'm a very slow painter, so you may have noticed that I've sped up the video a little bit. I do a lot of stopping and thinking. Moving on to the mouth, I'm going to build up a nice dark for the lip line. Same three colors, Quin Magenta, Brilliant Orange, and Perylene Maroon. And just looking carefully at my photo and always thinking shapes. Using some quinacridone coral for the lips. I do paint quite slowly for this first part of the portrait because I want to get these shapes just right, and then I'll be freer on subsequent layers once I have these established. So take your time, look at the reference photos, and get those shapes right from the start so you won't have to do any fixing later on. I'm going to have to think about adding some fun colors to the face pretty soon. Normally, by now I would have thrown in some blue or green or something. So that's at the back of my mind. I'm going to add a little peacock blue to some of my warm mixtures here and create a nice gray for the whites of her eyes. And just gonna get that in there. I don't want them to stay pure white, and if I add a little color and value, it'll make those sparkles pop even more. So I generally use cool colors at the corners of the eye. So I'm grabbing a little bit of peacock blue and getting it in the eye socket, and grabbing some of my orange mixture and just kind of softening it out. Letting the two colors mix on the paper. Leaving some edges hard and softening others. Just kind of looking for those little shapes. The shadow under her lower lip. Slowly getting some blue on here. All right, we'll get some blue in the temple area. That's always a good spot. And of course it's nice and dark there, but always working 10% value, a little bit more sometimes, kind of depends on what I'm doing. And I don't always do this, but here I'm taking that blue, putting it down, and then connecting it with orange and letting them blend on the paper. Other times I might just do this whole shape with blue. And let's start to establish. This is a very subtle edge. I don't want to outline her jaw, so I'm doing this really lightly. But there is a little bit of distinguishing there. Popping in some yellow in these warm areas. That was Windsor Yellow Deep. Looking for other areas to add that sunny yellow mixture. She's starting to come along. I'm going to have to get those irises put in pretty soon, but let's work with the color I have on the palette for now. Dropping in some blue and that shadow on the nose, softening edges. Remember that cast shadows are hard-edged and form shadows are soft. So that cast shadow from her nose is very important to get that right. Don't be afraid to leave hard edges on the face, especially in strong sunlight like this. And just niggling in some of that color here and there while it's on my palette. I'm looking at that cheek area. Just continuing to use the paint that's already on my palette, adding water, adding color as needed. But I want to get these cool shadows from her eyelashes in. And that cheekbone. Just kind of getting those in there. I love those little details on this face, those little fun shadow shapes. So I'm not sure if I mentioned this, but I generally work on a 90-degree angle, but for the purposes of this video, and so you can see my palette easily, I am working more of a 30 to 45 degree angle. So I still have an angle. So the paint is still being pulled down by gravity, and it's working just fine. So I'm still just working with the paint on my palette, finding a few little areas to use it before I move on. Some of these really light connected areas, just putting kind of a little piece of color there. Really light, real subtle. And now let's get those irises going. I'm just taking some Quin Burnt Orange and some Peacock Blue and mixing those together to creates a real pretty brown. And I'm just putting that right over top of her iris, right over top of the pupil, and then I'm dragging some of those edges into the eyelashes. And getting the pointy brush out so that I can get it perfect. Oh, but not too perfect, but kind of perfect. And then I'm going to take some of that color and start working on the eyebrows. Threw in a little Quin Gold in there as well to lighten it up in the sunny area. And softening edges. And you don't want the eyebrows to be too perfect, so kind of just get some of those shapes on there and then use your clean damp brush to soften edges. I popped a little peacock in there for variety. And I'm also thinking about those highlights at the top above her eyebrow, so I'm keeping that area light. And I'm using some of that mixed brown to begin to establish her hair. Throw a little extra peacock in there, some more quinburnt orange. Just get some variety in the hair. I also like to leave the blooms in the air, so I threw a little water in there and just kind of let it happen. Just starting to establish a few areas. I'm not planning to do the whole thing. I'm throwing a little ultramarine blue in the mix just to get some darker browns in there and get some of these real dark areas. I put the paint down and then I soften it out with watery paint or with water. Again, letting it bloom. And throwing a little Quin Gold in the mix on these warmer areas. I'm thinking about shapes and the direction of the hair, and I'm not worried about painting individual hairs. Moving on to the sunny side, I just took some Quin Gold and mixed it with the orange that was on my palette, and just kind of establishing some of these warm areas in her hair. And I'm just going to leave some of these beads of paint there to bloom. And I wanted to show you a close-up of my progress up to this point so that you'd get an accurate picture of my values and colors. It takes me several days to complete a portrait, even a small one like this, because I like to stop, let it dry overnight or at least for several hours. I can come back and look at it, think about it, what I might want to do next. So if you're continuing on, you might want to take a hair dryer and make sure it's good and dry before you continue. I don't generally use hair dryers, but I do have one of those little heat guns that are great. They don't blow the paint around, and they are very quiet. So anyway, so moving on into the hair, focusing on shapes, and I'm strictly using ultramarine blue. I am painting around the lighter areas, but it's not super important to get every little highlight, because I can lift the paint later at the end. Going back and darkening the darkest areas, getting that hard line against her ear. And letting things happen. You probably notice those pins, and I just want to mention that you're not pinning the paper, you're pinning next to the paper so that you don't damage it. This way I can float the paintings afterwards if I like, and they have a nice deckled edge where I painted all the way to the edge. Here, even though the hair is really light against her face, I still wanted to establish that edge. So I did put a blue line along her eyebrow edge and cheek, and down further where the hair is darker, I'm going right into the ultramarine blue, getting a nice strong edge against her neck and jaw and against her clothing, and establishing some of those darker shapes in her hair on the sunny side. So starting with the hair on what I would call my second layer is kind of a warm-up. So I'm getting my brush moving before I start thinking about working on the flesh. And so I'm assessing the reference photo and thinking about how I'm going to approach this shadow area of her flesh. But before I do that, I'm grabbing some quinacridone rose and just putting some color on her shirt. And before I clean my palette, let's see if there's anything else I want to do. Get a little more value on her little sideburn, softening it out so it's not too perfect. Okay, so I'm going to look carefully at my reference photo and mix up some paint to start working on the shadow side of her face. So I've got some peacock blue because I know I'm going to want to add that to her jawline where I see some reflected color. And I'm mixing up Quin Coral with some Winsor Yellow Deep to kind of get a mid flesh tone. I don't need a whole lot of paint because this is such a small piece, but if I were working on a larger piece, I definitely want to be mixing up larger puddles to make sure I have enough because I want to do that shadow side in one pass. So I pulled out some Quin Magenta for the darkest areas, and I'm going to start on her forehead, temple area. And before that dries, I want to soften out the edge with the lighter flesh tone and tickling the edges with my clean damp brush, going into peacock blue, just kind of varying it sort of like we did the first layer, working down the page and letting the colors mix on the paper. And I'm just varying the color according to what I see. So I'm getting that blue on the jawline and adding the orange and the magenta to finish off that section. Making sure no blooms happen and taking my clean damp brush, tickling a few edges. Some more Quin Magenta. Now that I've got that left side done, I can start working on the smaller shadow shapes around the eyes and the mouth. And tickling those edges so it not too hard of a line. Just looking around, seeing where I might add some of the flesh tones and darken the shadow areas. If you're having trouble with either too much liquid on your brush or too dry of a brush, just know that it just comes with practice, knowing how much pigment to water ratio you need to use. Here on the shadow, the cast shadows on her shirt, I'm using Quin Magenta with less water to create a darker value and just getting those shadows in. The cast shadows, you want them to read across the page. So even though this is sort of at the very edge of the painting and you might think it's not that important, I think it really is important. So while I've got that magenta on my brush, I'm darkening areas on her lip line, her nostrils, the inside corners of her eyes. As I mentioned in the beginning, I would be putting several layers in these areas. So I'm continuing to check the values on my reference photos and build up those values as we go. Even more magenta try to get that ear is pretty dark. It's in shadow, and so we need to make sure we get that dark enough. Tickling the edges. And I do not have a formula, so I could just as easily be doing that with a mixture of Scarlet Lake and Ultramarine Blue or Perylene Maroon. But Quin Magenta is kind of new to my palette, and I really like it. Adding a little yellow in there where it's real sunny on the photo. Okay, so I'm mixing up Mission Red Brown with Hooker's Green for a nice, dark, beautiful brown. And the second puddle is just Mission Red Brown by itself, and the third puddle is a watery version of Mission Red Brown with some Quin Gold. So I can kind of work around the values of her hair. I have my two Kolinsky sable brushes ready. One will be used for the paint, and the other will be kept clean and damp to soften edges. Starting with the rich brown, just glazing right over the previous layer, which should be bone dry by now, and just taking a little bit of that paint to create some of the little wispy hairs coming across her forehead and softening them with my damp clean brush, and coming down to this dark area behind her ear and just switching puddles to give it variety. And making connections, softening edges as I go. I do want to let those beads of paint bloom. I want to soften that hairline against her face because it's all in shadow, so it shouldn't be a real strong line. I'm going to mix up some flesh tone, some Scarlet Lake with Windsor Yellow Deep, and try to get that along the hairline before it dries completely to kind of make that a softer line. And then softening those edges. Okay, and taking some of that flesh tone into her cheek, intensifying a little bit, making it a little redder by adding Scarlet Lake to the mix. And looking at my reference photos carefully, I want to reserve that little highlight I've got on her jawline. So I'm going to mix up some peacock and pop that in there and make all these connections, soften some edges. And remember, I always have that second clean brush handy. And I'm using that sponge next to my palette to dab off the excess water off my brush. That's how I control the water. I'm looking at the hair on the sunny side, and I've still got plenty of puddle mixtures for that. So I'm going to start with the warmer mixture at the top. Get a few flyaways and then just get some color down. Look how nicely that brown mixture is toning down that ultramarine blue on the other side. So it's working. So softening some areas with water where I want it very light, and now going back into my Mission Red Brown and then the darker mixture. The darker mixture is Mission Red Brown and Hooker's Green. I'm just popping some in here and there while it's still wet, just to keep it soft. You know, you could be preserving some of these highlights in her hair with masking fluid, but because I know that I'll be able to lift them out later, I'm not worrying about it. And I think they look more natural when I lift them with a brush later rather than the hard lines that masking fluid leaves. Still fiddling, trying to get a little bit of flyaways going. I need to think about what I'm going to do in that top corner because her hair does not go all the way up to the corner. So I may do some negative painting up there just to suggest some flyaways. Going right back in with more of this dark mixture since I've got it on my palette. I just want to strengthen some of these values. As long as I'm not going in with anything wetter than the paper, I'm safe. And there's my softening brush. Okay. And I'm thinking that the left side of the page is dry enough where I can do another layer there as well. I added some more Mission Red Brown to that dark mix, and now I'm taking a lot of the water out of the brush so I can sort of maneuver it, tickle it out, soften edges. And do a little bit more forming. Remember, we're just thinking about the direction of the hair, not worrying about every single hair, just thinking shapes and value. And as it's watercolor, it dries lighter, so that's why it requires several layers. But I just love the look of it, the way the colors underneath glow through each layer. And I just pick up the pins and put them back in if they get in the way. A little bit of mineral violet here to darken some of the shadows in her shirt. Just especially along the neckline there. And of course, since I have mineral violet on my brush, I've got to go around the page and put it in other places. So got a little bit in her eyes, her eyelashes, the eyebrows, just little bits. And you can see how much drier the paint is. Well, so it's staying put. Just using that to darken some values. Trying to lose some of the edges so I cross right over from the hair to the flesh. Keeping the jawline very clean. And using all these dark pigments is making a mess of my palette, and the water's getting pretty dirty, so I'm going to clean that up. Okay. So she's coming along, and I'm seeing the form of her face and the shadows, but I do need to intensify, especially the eye sockets, the shadow from the nose, So I mixed up some more orange and quin magenta, and that's the same mixture I started with the darks. And so I'm getting that right into the eye socket, around the eyes, just here and there. Again, looking carefully at my reference photos. And one thing I like about getting those shadow shapes in there early and light is that now I know what I'm doing. I don't have to question where to put the color or to put the value. I've already got the shapes pretty much set. Definitely need to darken that shadow on her mouth and under her lip. And actually I need to get some more color on her lips. So adding a little bit more orange and making it kind of watery. I'm going to go ahead and apply that. And connect it with the shadow underneath there. And it dried light again, so I'm doing it again. More on the nose. So reds seem to take several layers to really get the intensity that you're looking for. Just thinking about where else I can put it, what else I need to darken. Little shapes. Okay, ultramarine blue. I'm just going to take that on the top corner and use that to negatively paint around some of these flyaway hairs. And if I get it on strong enough the first time, I may not have to do anything else there. And I'm not worried, about it being perfect. Again, I'll be able to do some lifting later. And besides, we don't want it to be perfect. The little flyaway hairs kind of go in and out of the light. So we don't want to paint spaghetti. Taking that same ultramarine and adding some to her eyelashes, her hair, always darkening, adding little shapes here and there. I'm grabbing my teeny tiny pointy brush is what I'm calling it. It's just a synthetic. And I'm still using that ultramarine blue, and I'm getting some of these little tiny eyelashes at the lower lashes. And what you're seeing me do now is I just grabbed a little bit of a black mixture that I keep near my palette. It's a mixture of phthalo blue with perylene maroon, and it makes a really nice transparent dark black that I can use for a number of things, really. And this brush that I'm using, I don't usually use it, but except for to sign my paintings with, but it's a number 2. And it's just perfect for these mini portraits and some of the fine lines I want to get. And I'm adding the pupils. All right, I can see that the flesh still needs to go darker, so I'm going for my quin magenta, getting on the ear, adding some to the hair, adding some Windsor Yellow Deep to it. At this stage, her flesh looks pretty cold with all that red and quin magenta, so I'm going to use this warmer mixture to start to warm that up. Now here it's very warm in the sunny side. Adding a little more magenta to the shadow side just to darken it. And then going back into the yellow, back and forth. Oh, I like that yellow. And it's kind of funny as I'm watching myself paint and do this voiceover. I I'm not sure if I've ever used Winsor Yellow Deep with Quin Magenta before. As I said, Quin Magenta is pretty new to my palette, but it just goes to show I really don't have a formula. I don't know, it's just instinct. I think it's important to work with a limited palette where you can really learn how your colors play together, how they react to each other, what their properties are, and you don't really need to have every color that they make out there. So here I'm just going to warm up her cheek a little bit and soften it out with water. And I think we're at a stopping point so we can see where we're at. And it doesn't look like we have a whole lot left to do. Just warming up that chin. Okay, let's see where we're at. We're pretty close, but she still looks kind of purple. Also, I think it's time to take the masking fluid off her eyelashes and around her eyes. So we'll do that and get back to work. So I want to use a warmer version of the dark because I still feel like I need to increase the value. So this is probably Scarlet Lake mixed with Winter Yellow Deep. And here is more of an orange mixture just to darken that shadow area. The orange will warm up where it looked more purple, and the red will warm it, but it'll also darken it. Yep, I'm just softening those edges, dropping in some more of that red. I really want it to be dark enough. I think we're ready to be done here. So as long as it's wet enough, I can continue to drop in color. So and just take your time doing it. As you know, this is sped up, so I'm doing it a lot more slowly and carefully than what you're seeing. And we'll just connect this area on our chin with that watery orange. I think just a little more on the nose. Let's tone it down with a little bit of the orange mixture. Remember to continually refer to your reference photos. We're looking for value, shapes, and I'm just adding a little blue to the inside of her ear to darken it and also to tone it down. A little more Scarlet Lake on the inside of her eyes. Just want to get that dark enough there. Just these final touches just require a lot of thought. I already had a little ultramarine blue on my palette, so I've added a little bit of Quin Burnt Orange to make a dark brown, and I'm just intensifying the irises and looking for other areas where I might use that color while it's on my brush. Just kind of going around and seeing where I could add value. With my glazing technique, it takes many layers to get it as dark as I want it, and I am a pretty high key painter, so I don't go super dark, but taking these dabs of color to add some variety into the hair, whether it's color or value. I keep working on that little flyaway hair, and you'll see I'll get that fixed later. But back into the red on this shadow side of her nose, a little bit of Scarlet Lake with some Winsor Yellow Deep. Again, just it requires several layers. I might think I'm done, and then after it sits a while, I'll decide I need to go darker, and that's what happened here. Grabbing a little ultramarine blue because the reds and yellows just aren't cutting it. And now we're going to get to the fun part where I'm going to grab my eradicator brush or any stiff flat brush. I'm getting most of the moisture out of it and just using that to lift some of the fine flyaway hairs. I can dab it or not, it just kind of depends. Different paints are going to react differently, but with this layered technique, you should be able to lift enough color so that you can see the lines. Some staining colors will be not as easy to lift, but I don't seem to have much trouble. Here, once I've lifted a little bit, now I can paint alongside of those little flyaways to make them really stand out. At this stage of the process, we're getting so close to being finished. Yes, I'm looking at the reference photos, but I'm also just seeing what the painting needs. So I'm lifting some highlights here, softening some of those areas that I might have felt like I got too dark or too hard. I'm connecting some of those flyaway hairs so they go dark to light. And I especially like to cross over some of the shapes I've made, especially if they're boring or too perfect. So once I get a little bit of paint on that brush, I want to take a tissue and wipe it off or possibly rinse it so I'm not dragging paint around. That little sideburn area really bothered me, so I couldn't wait to kind of pull a flyaway across it to make it less, I don't know, weird. I've grabbed my smallest eradicator brush just to see if I could get a little more variety in these little strands of hair. But the medium size brush is my favorite for what I like to do. So I like how the blue is showing through the hair color. I do like to play around with color and start the darkest areas of the hair with a green or a peacock blue or an ultramarine blue. It adds interest to the painting, and it's really the values that are important. Value does all the work and color gets the glory. I'm sure you've heard that before. And again, taking that large dark spot and just creating a few strands of hair running through it or across it, and finding a few more places to lift highlights on the flesh. I lost a bit of the contrast in the fun little shadow area here from her eyelashes, casting shadows on her cheek. So lighten that up, softening the tip of her nose. Anywhere that my edges might be too hard, I can niggle those. It's really hard to stop. Have to darken a few more areas. Just a little bit more lifting. And now I'm taking some of that Quinburnt orange and ultramarine blue mixture, and I'm going to just paint around some of the highlights that I've pulled out, as I showed you earlier, and just increase the contrast, and so those really pop. And just like the lifted areas, I'm being selective on where I add these darks as I'm getting toward the end. And I can't thank you enough for being here with me today. And it's been an honor and a privilege to teach you a little bit about how I paint my little portraits. And with my ultramarine blue and Quinburnt orange mixture, I picked up my little #2 brush to get some of these tiny details around her eyes, eyelashes, pupil, and my signature. And there's always a little more to do, even after I sign it. Just these teeny tiny darks here and there, tiny lower lashes, and a little perylene maroon mixed with that dark to darken the inside corners of her eyes, the eyelid crease, the nostrils, and the lip line. And she's finished. My goal was to capture her expression, her essence, her free spirit, and I think I've done that. Thank you for joining me on this little painting journey. I hope you had fun painting your little mini portrait, and I hope that you learned a lot. I do have a blog on my website and a newsletter where I've got all kinds of tips and tricks and advice, and from my perspective, what works for me that might work for you as well if you want to check those out. And hopefully I'll see you around in the art world again soon. Thank you.